It gives me great pleasure to introduce my good friend, Ben Saunders, director of the Comics and Cartoon Studies program at the University of Oregon. Ben, welcome.
Great to be here. Good to see you.
The first thing I'd like you to talk about is this wonderful Marvel show that is coming to Chicago, which is not far from Louisville and will be a great road trip opportunity for students here at the University of Louisville to go up and check out. Tell us about that.
Sure. So, Marvel Universe of Superheroes is the biggest and most comprehensive exhibition devoted to Marvel as an entertainment industry player. So, the focus is not exclusively on comics, but we tell the story of the company from its origins through to the present. And we kind of have a transmedia approach where we move between comics and other forms of media, not just films, but also some of the TV shows and the cartoons. It has over 300 objects. I could spend a long time just describing the show: costumes, props, pieces of original art, which is some of my favorite stuff, and also these sort of interactive elements, rooms and spaces that statues that you can get your selfies with, and a couple of gallery rooms that are interactive, immersive experiences.
And where did the show debut and where has it been in its travels so far?
We debuted at the Museum of Pop Culture in Seattle, MoPop, as it is called there. It went from there to Philadelphia to the Franklin Institute, which was also just terrific. And then from there, it went to Edmonton, Canada for a short stop. And then it's currently on display at the Henry Ford Museum in Dearborn, Detroit area.
What are some of the pieces that the crowds respond to most and why?
So there's something really for everybody. If you are an old school Marvel fan, people respond really powerfully, I find, to the original art. That's the hand-drawn boards from which the comics were shot. Marvel did not keep an archive of that art. The art was all returned to the artists in the 1980s, who then sold it to private collectors. So there's no way to see that art unless you happen to own a piece of it or go to this show. So we have very key moments: the death of Gwen Stacy from Spider-Man, some iconic covers, first appearances, the first appearance of the Vision, the first appearance of the Falcon, which is obviously a historic moment. So those pieces really blow the minds of old school fans. Then people they're excited about the movies. They love the costumes. We have, just as an example, the late and much lamented Chadwick Boseman's Black Panther costume. The original costume is on display. We have shields from Mjolnir from the Avengers movies, the Captain America shield. So everybody wants to get their picture with a different thing. It really varies. The statues, the sculptures are hugely popular because you can interact with those. I think my favorite is the one of the Thing, the classic character from the Fantastic Four. I always think of him as I think of the Fantastic Four as that's the family version of superheroes. It's sort of the Incredibles is really in many ways a riff on the Fantastic Four, and he is kind of like the grumpy uncle. So I originally wanted him to be falling asleep in front of a TV set with a pizza box in front of him. That was my concept for that statue. Marvel decided that they didn't want him to be fully asleep because they were worried people would think he was dead. So we put a book in his hand so that it looks like he's kind of nodding off, and put him on a big couch with a window behind him, so it looks like he's kind of just hanging out in his home. And people could sit next to him and get that picture with him while this action takes place in the window behind. The sequence behind him is animated. And that I've seen people line up for that one just to get their picture with him.
So tell us the path that a professor who uh, got credentialed as a scholar of John Donne and Shakespeare, ends up being the curator of this Marvel Comics show.
So glad you asked, really, because I think it's an opportunity to talk about, amongst other things, the value of what we do as professors of literature. I became a professor of literature because of my early exposure to comics as reading material. I learned to read from comics, and I think it was the moment where I had the experience for the first time in my life of kind of falling into the page and just going down the rabbit hole and disappearing into the experience of reading. And to be motivated to read, it was, I remember buying, my grandmother had bought me a British reprint of a Spider-Man comic. And I was about 6 years old, and the reading thing hadn't fully happened for me. And I was trying to get my mother to read the comic to me or explain things to me. And she had no interest, to be honest. She was suspicious of it as, American rubbish, I think is probably how she felt about it at the time, and not the sort of thing she necessarily wanted me to read. I asked her, is Spider-Man a good guy or a bad guy? And she said, with a name like that, I'm sure he must be a bad guy. So not only was this encounter with comics my first encounter with moral ambiguity, but also an early lesson in not trusting my parents. The path of my life in some ways is shaped by that early encounter. And of course, it's the opposite of the kind of thing that people used to say about comics, which is that they are not literature, that they will actually cause people to not develop properly as readers, that they will become overly dependent on images, and equally silly things that people at one time believed. Absolutely, I am testimony that the opposite is the case.
Tell us a little bit about this undergraduate program that you've developed at the University of Oregon, and specifically what makes students want to study comics and cartoons, and what sorts of skills do they acquire, and what sort of initial jobs do you see your students getting?
Obviously, given the variety of majors that's actually interested in the field, they can go on to any number of professions. I have at least a couple of very successful students who have gone on to work in the comics industry. One of my best students from 2 years ago is now an editor at Marvel Comics. So really though, it's a storytelling medium. It's a form of visual narrative. So students who are interested in narrative and storytelling, the English majors, they gravitate towards it, and they learn more about the business of storytelling from it. And the more you know about communication, the more you know about storytelling, the more fields for careers are available to you.
When you started this new aspect of your professional life, curating, what skills did you find yourself drawing on from your own background as somebody who ultimately became an English professor?
So as a professor of literature, one of the things that I've been doing all of my professional life is thinking about narrative and thinking about form, and the relationship between form and content. That's extraordinarily valuable when trying to talk about comics, because you're talking about one of the most interesting things formally. You're talking about a form of visual narrative that allows you to see a sequence of images and individual moments, and you see it all at once, and then your eye moves around the page. So to come up with a vocabulary to try and describe the effects of what it means to have those sort of formal relationships in tension, I actually think my training in poetry was probably the most helpful thing in terms of trying to think about the way the beats work on a traditional comics page, the way in which layout can affect our sense of, for example, how time is unfolding, whether you're seeing action unfold in what we perceive as a very rapid motion, or whether we're seeing time in a very slowed down way. So that training was very helpful just in terms of describing what's actually going on when we read.
When you go into the classroom, what is one of the big goals that you have as a teacher when you teach this art?
That's an excellent question. I guess the goals vary from text to text. One of the first things that I hope students will learn is that we interpret images in the same way that we interpret words. There is an assumption out there that just in the cliches, the idea that, a picture is worth 1,000 words. There's the idea that perpetuated even in Scott McCloud's Understanding Comics, and I think this is a mistake, that somehow images are more immediate and that words are more abstract and require more interpretation. I really try to push back against that. I think that's based on an ancient prejudice against the visual, and get students to try and think about the way in which we do in fact read images, that images come to us in contexts that require forms of decoding, that while that process is more naturalized for us, so it can feel more rapid and immediate, actually images are things that we read.
For my students and the other students here at the University of Louisville, if they get a chance to go up and see the show, or if they're taking Dr. Turner's class, what's the best way for them to get in touch with you if they want to reach you?
Oh, sure. I would welcome emails from anyone who goes to the show and has a question or anything of that kind. You can just reach me through my University of Oregon homepage. My email address is on there. People can reach me through the homepage.
I'd like to thank our friend of the department, Professor Ben Saunders, for joining us and giving us a preview of this Marvel exhibit that's coming to Chicago this spring. Thanks again, Ben.
Oh, it was great to see you. Thank you for having me. I hope in different circumstances I might have a chance to even visit Louisville again. Good to see you.